Sometimes the people you would do anything for are the very ones who show you exactly where you stand. Margaret Wilson did not know that one ordinary Tuesday morning in Houston, Texas, would divide her life into two parts: everything before that day and everything after. At 72 years old, Margaret had always believed family came first. She had spent decades living by that simple rule. She had raised her son Jason on her own after losing her husband years earlier. She had worked long hours, skipped vacations, and put aside countless personal dreams to make sure he never went without. And when Jason married Emily, Margaret welcomed her into the family without hesitation. She helped whenever she could, watched their home when they traveled, and never complained when plans changed at the last minute. So when Margaret felt a sudden tightness in her chest one weekend and her doctor advised her to go to the hospital for observation, she was not particularly worried. Jason drove her there himself. Emily sat beside her in the waiting area. They both spoke kindly, reassuring her that everything would be fine. The doctors ran tests and decided to keep her for a few days. It was nothing immediately dangerous, they explained, but they wanted to monitor her closely. Jason squeezed her hand and promised he would come back first thing in the morning. Emily smiled and said she would bring her favorite blueberry muffins. Margaret believed them. Why wouldn't she? That night, she fell asleep feeling grateful. Grateful for the nurses. Grateful for the doctors. Most of all, grateful for family. But the next morning, when sunlight filtered through the hospital room window, something felt different. Margaret opened her eyes and instinctively reached for her phone. No messages. No missed calls. She glanced toward the door, expecting Jason to walk in at any moment. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. Lunch arrived. Still nothing. At first she made excuses for them. Maybe traffic was terrible. Maybe Jason had been called into work unexpectedly. Maybe Emily was running errands. Yet as the afternoon stretched on, an uneasy feeling settled in her stomach. She checked her phone. Again, nothing. Then she noticed a notification from social media. It was a photograph posted less than 2 hours earlier. Margaret stared at the screen, blinking as if her eyes were playing tricks on her. There was Jason. There was Emily, both smiling broadly beneath the bright lights of an international airport terminal. Suitcases beside them, boarding passes in hand. The caption was short and cheerful. "Europe, here we come." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. She looked at the date, the time, the location tag. There was no mistake. While she sat alone in a hospital bed in Texas, her son and daughter-in-law were already on their way across the Atlantic. And in that quiet hospital room, with only the hum of medical equipment around her, a question slowly formed in her mind. If they could leave this easily, had she ever really been as important to them as she believed? Margaret continued staring at the photograph long after the screen had gone dark. She could not understand what hurt more, the fact that Jason and Emily had left, or the fact that neither of them had thought to tell her. The cheerful smiles on their faces replayed in her mind again and again. They did not look worried. They did not look conflicted. They looked excited. For the rest of the afternoon, she tried to convince herself there had to be an explanation. Perhaps the trip had been arranged suddenly. Perhaps they intended to return in a day or two. Perhaps they assumed she would be discharged quickly. Yet every explanation felt weaker than the one before. Finally, shortly before dinner, she picked up her phone and called Jason. The call went straight to voicemail. She waited 10 minutes and tried again. The result was the same. She then sent a simple message asking if everything was all right. No accusation. No anger. Just a question. Hours passed without a response. The hospital grew quieter as evening settled outside the windows. Nurses moved through the halls with soft voices and measured steps. Margaret watched families visit other patients. She saw daughters carrying flowers, husbands bringing magazines, grandchildren sharing stories from school. Each sight made the room feel a little emptier. Around 9 o'clock, her phone finally buzzed. Her heart lifted for a moment. It was a message from Emily. Margaret opened it immediately. The words were brief. Emily explained that the trip had been planned months earlier and that canceling it would have been difficult. She added that the doctors said Margaret was stable and wished her a speedy recovery. That was all. Margaret read the message 3 times. Not once did it mention regret. Not once did it ask how she was feeling. Not once did it explain why nobody had told her beforehand. She set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, she allowed herself to stop making excuses. The next morning, a nurse named Rebecca stopped by to check her blood pressure. Rebecca was kind and had spoken with Margaret several times since her admission. Sensing that something was wrong, she gently asked whether family would be visiting later that day. Margaret forced a smile and said she was not sure. Rebecca nodded, but the expression on her face suggested she understood more than Margaret realized. After the nurse left, Margaret looked around the room. She suddenly noticed how much of her life had revolved around other people. Every major decision she had made over the years had included the question of what was best for Jason. She had never minded. A mother was supposed to care for her child. But sitting alone in that hospital room, she began wondering when she had last asked what was best for herself. It was an unfamiliar question, one she had not considered in decades. And as another long day passed, something subtle began to change inside her. The sadness remained, but beneath it, another feeling was slowly taking shape. It was quiet. It was steady. And for the first time since seeing that photograph, Margaret realized that when she finally left the hospital, she might not return to life exactly as it had been before. 2 days later, Margaret was discharged from the hospital. The doctors were satisfied with her progress and gave her clear instructions for rest and follow-up appointments. Rebecca walked beside her as she made her way toward the exit. Before leaving, the nurse smiled warmly and told her to take good care of herself. The simple words stayed with Margaret longer than she expected. As she stepped into the Texas sunshine, she realized that nobody from her family had come to pick her up. She had already arranged a ride home through a local transportation service recommended by the hospital. The driver was polite and friendly, making casual conversation during the 40-minute trip across Houston. Margaret appreciated the kindness, but she found herself looking out the window most of the time. Familiar streets passed by, restaurants she had visited with Jason when he was young, parks where she had watched him play baseball, stores where she had spent years buying birthday gifts and holiday decorations. Every mile seemed connected to a memory, yet those memories no longer felt quite the same. When she arrived home, the house greeted her with silence. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything was exactly where she had left it. The framed family photographs, the carefully arranged furniture, the kitchen table where countless family dinners had taken place. For years, the house had felt full of purpose. Now it felt strangely large. Margaret set her overnight bag down and slowly walked from room to room. In the living room, she paused in front of a photograph taken nearly 20 years earlier. Jason was standing beside her, smiling proudly on the day he graduated from college. She remembered working extra shifts to help pay tuition. She remembered missing vacations and postponing purchases so he could have opportunities she never had. Looking at the picture now, she did not regret those sacrifices. What troubled her was something else. She wondered whether Jason had ever truly understood them. Later that evening, she opened social media again. New photographs from Europe had appeared. Jason and Emily were standing in front of famous landmarks, enjoying expensive meals, and smiling beneath bright summer skies. Friends and relatives filled the comments with congratulations and compliments. Margaret noticed that neither of them had mentioned her hospitalization. Not once. She closed the application and set the phone aside. For the first time, she felt no desire to send a message, no desire to ask questions, no desire to explain her disappointment. Instead, she sat quietly with a cup of tea and allowed herself to think honestly. She began reviewing the last several years of her life. Small moments she had ignored suddenly seemed important. Promises that had been forgotten, visits that had been postponed, calls that had gone unanswered. None of them had seemed significant on their own, but together they painted a picture she could no longer overlook. As the evening grew darker, Margaret walked into her home office and opened a desk drawer. Inside were folders containing financial records, property documents, and personal papers she had not reviewed in years. She looked at them for several seconds before pulling the first folder out and placing it on the desk. Then she reached for her reading glasses and sat down. Somewhere deep inside, a decision was beginning to form. She was not entirely certain where it would lead, but for the first time in a very long while, the future she was considering belonged to her alone. The next morning, Margaret woke earlier than usual. For a few moments, she lay quietly in bed, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant sounds of traffic beyond her neighborhood. The house felt calm, but something inside her had changed. The uncertainty that had followed her home from the hospital was slowly being replaced by clarity. After breakfast, She sat down at the dining room table with the folders she had gathered the night before. One by one, she reviewed years of documents, property records, insurance policies, investment statements, retirement accounts. She was surprised by how long it had been since she had looked at any of them closely. For years, she had assumed there would always be time later. Time to organize things. Time to make plans. Time to think about herself. Now she realized that later had finally arrived. Over the next several days, Margaret developed a quiet routine. Every morning she spent a few hours reviewing paperwork and making notes. Every afternoon, she took a short walk around the neighborhood as part of her recovery. Neighbors waved and stopped to chat. Most of them had no idea what had happened. Margaret smiled politely and kept her thoughts to herself. She was not interested in sympathy. She was interested in understanding what came next. Meanwhile, Jason and Emily continued posting photographs from Europe. Margaret noticed them less and less. The images no longer caused the sharp pain they once had. Instead, they served as a reminder. Every smiling photograph reinforced a simple truth. While they focused on enjoying their lives, she needed to start rebuilding her own. One afternoon, Margaret scheduled an appointment with an attorney she had worked with years earlier when updating her estate documents. She did not tell anyone about the meeting. The attorney, a professional woman named Carol Bennett, welcomed her warmly and listened carefully as Margaret explained that she wanted to review her affairs. Carol asked thoughtful questions and carefully examined the documents Margaret had brought. By the end of the meeting, Margaret understood her situation far better than she had before. Everything was in order, but Carol encouraged her to think carefully about what she truly wanted for the years ahead. The question stayed with Margaret during the drive home. What did she want? It sounded simple, yet she struggled to answer it. For decades, her goals had been connected to someone else. Supporting her family, helping her son, maintaining the house, fulfilling responsibilities. But now she found herself considering possibilities she had never seriously explored. She thought about traveling. She thought about joining community groups. She thought about living somewhere that required less maintenance and offered more opportunities to meet people. None of these ideas felt reckless. They felt practical, exciting, even. A few days later, she made another appointment, this time with a local real estate professional. The meeting was brief and entirely informational. Margaret simply wanted to understand the market value of her home. Yet as she listened to the numbers being discussed, she felt a surprising sense of freedom. For the first time, she began viewing the house not as an obligation or a symbol of the past, but as one option among many. That evening, she sat alone on the back patio watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. She thought about the woman she had been only a few weeks earlier. A woman who expected life to continue exactly as it always had. That woman was slowly disappearing. In her place, someone new was beginning to emerge. Someone who was no longer waiting for others to decide how much she mattered. Over the following 2 weeks, Margaret became surprisingly busy. Anyone looking from the outside would have assumed she was simply catching up on errands after her hospital stay. In reality, she was building a plan one careful step at a time. The real estate professional returned with a detailed market analysis and walked her through recent sales in the area. Margaret listened attentively, asking questions she would never have considered asking in the past. She wanted facts, timelines, and options. By the end of the meeting, she had a much clearer picture of what her future could look like. What surprised her most was not the value of the property. It was the realization that she had choices. For years, she had viewed the house as something permanent, almost untouchable. Now she saw it differently. It had served its purpose during one chapter of her life, but perhaps it did not need to define the next one. A few days later, she visited a retirement community located about 30 miles outside Houston. The place was nothing like the outdated image she had carried in her mind. The grounds were beautiful and well-maintained. Walking paths wound through landscaped gardens. Residents gathered for coffee, exercise classes, book clubs, and community events. Margaret spent nearly 3 hours there speaking with staff members and several residents. What struck her most was the energy. These people were not waiting for life to happen. They were living it. On the drive home, she felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. Excitement. Meanwhile, Jason and Emily remained overseas. Their social media updates continued appearing every few days. Margaret noticed that neither of them had called. There were occasional short text messages asking whether she was feeling better, but the conversations never lasted long. The distance between them no longer felt measured in miles. It felt measured in priorities. One afternoon, while sorting through a closet, Margaret came across several boxes filled with old keepsakes. School projects Jason had made as a child, birthday cards, family photographs from decades earlier. She sat on the floor for nearly an hour looking through them. Some memories made her smile. Others brought tears to her eyes. Yet instead of feeling trapped by the past, she felt grateful for it. Those years had been real. The love had been real. But she finally understood that honoring those memories did not require sacrificing her future. By the end of the month, several unfamiliar vehicles had begun appearing in her driveway. A contractor stopped by to provide an estimate for minor repairs. A photographer visited to take pictures of the property. An inspector conducted a routine evaluation. Neighbors occasionally waved and asked casual questions, but Margaret kept her answers polite and vague. She was not hiding out of spite. She simply wanted space to make decisions without interference. Every completed appointment strengthened her confidence. Every signature moved her one step closer to a future she had chosen for herself. And while thousands of miles away, Jason and Emily enjoyed the final days of their European vacation, neither of them realized that back in Texas, the life they assumed would always be waiting for them was quietly beginning to disappear. As summer moved forward, Margaret's plan accelerated. What had begun as a series of private conversations was now becoming reality. The house was officially listed on the market, though very few people knew about it. The real estate agent advised discretion during the early stages, and Margaret was more than happy to keep things quiet. She did not feel the need to announce her decisions or seek approval from anyone. For the first time in years, she was making choices based entirely on what felt right for her own future. The response from potential buyers was stronger than expected. Within days, multiple showings had been scheduled. Margaret temporarily stayed with a friend during some of the appointments, enjoying long lunches and pleasant conversations while strangers walked through the home she had spent decades maintaining. Surprisingly, she did not feel sadness. Instead, she felt lighter with each passing week. Every room she packed reminded her that she was creating space for something new. Every box she sealed represented a chapter completed rather than a chapter lost. One morning, while sorting old kitchen items, she received a brief message from Jason. He mentioned that their trip had been wonderful and that they would be returning to Texas soon. He attached a photograph of himself and Emily smiling beside a famous European landmark. Margaret looked at the image for a few seconds before setting her phone aside. The message contained no mention of her recovery, no questions about her recent appointments, no curiosity about how she had spent the last several weeks. That absence spoke louder than any words could have. She responded politely, wishing them a safe trip home. Nothing more. A few days later, an offer arrived on the house. It was strong, clean, and far better than Margaret had expected when the process began. After discussing the details with her agent and attorney, she accepted. The paperwork moved quickly. Inspections were completed. Deadlines were met. Signatures were collected. With each step, the future became less theoretical and more real. Around the same time, she finalized arrangements with the retirement community she had visited earlier. She selected a comfortable residence with enough space for her favorite furniture, family photographs, and treasured keepsakes. The community offered activities, transportation, dining options, and opportunities to meet new people. Margaret found herself looking forward to the move, not because she was running away from anything, but because she was finally moving towards something. As the closing date approached, moving trucks began appearing at the property. Furniture was carefully wrapped and loaded. Personal belongings were organized and transported. Neighbors noticed the activity and exchanged curious glances. A few stopped by to ask whether she was remodeling or downsizing. Margaret simply smiled and said she was exploring a new chapter. It was the truth, even if it was not the entire story. Meanwhile, Jason and Emily boarded their flight back to the United States. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, they relaxed in their seats and talked about returning home. They discussed unpacking, catching up with friends, and settling back into their normal routine. Neither of them suspected that the version of home waiting in Texas no longer existed. While they imagined everything exactly as they had left it, Margaret stood inside her nearly empty living room for the final time. She looked around at the bare walls, smiled softly, and locked the front door behind her. Then she walked away without looking back. The following afternoon, Jason and Emily finally arrived back in Houston. Exhausted from travel but still energized by weeks of sightseeing, they loaded their luggage into a rental vehicle and began the familiar drive through the city. During the trip, they talked about photographs they planned to share with friends and the adjustments of returning to everyday life. The conversation felt normal, comfortable, predictable. Neither of them had any reason to believe that anything significant had changed while they were away. As they turned into Margaret's neighborhood, Jason immediately noticed something unusual. A vehicle he did not recognize was parked in the driveway. At first, he assumed a contractor or visitor might be there. But as they got closer, another detail caught his attention. The flower pots near the front entrance were different. The welcome mat was gone. Even the curtains visible through the windows had changed. Emily frowned and looked around. Something felt off. Jason parked along the curb and stepped out. He walked toward the front door carrying a confused expression. When he reached the porch, he hesitated for a moment before ringing the bell. A few seconds later, the door opened. Standing there was a man neither of them had ever seen before. Jason blinked in surprise. He glanced past the stranger into the house. The furniture was different. The walls displayed unfamiliar artwork. The place looked nothing like the home he remembered. Politely, Jason explained that he was looking for Margaret Wilson. The man listened patiently before responding. He introduced himself as the property's new owner and explained that he had purchased the house several weeks earlier. For a moment, Jason simply stared at him. He was certain he had misunderstood. He asked the man to repeat what he had said. The answer remained the same. The property had been sold. The transaction was complete. The previous owner no longer lived there. Emily looked at Jason in disbelief. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The reality felt impossible. They thanked the homeowner for his time and slowly returned to the vehicle. Once inside, Jason immediately reached for his phone and called his mother. This time she answered. Her voice sounded calm and relaxed. Jason quickly asked where she was and what had happened to the house. Margaret paused briefly before telling him she had moved. She explained that she was living in a retirement community outside the city and that she was doing very well. The simplicity of her answer only deepened his confusion. He asked why she had not told them. Margaret replied gently that there never seemed to be a good opportunity. After all, everyone had been busy. The words were polite, but they landed with unexpected weight. Jason suddenly remembered the hospital, the unanswered calls, the photographs from Europe, the short messages that had replaced meaningful conversations. For the first time since returning home, he began to understand that while he had been focused on his own plans, his mother had quietly built an entirely new life without him. And sitting in the parked vehicle outside a house that no longer belonged to their family, Jason realized that the biggest surprise was not that the property had been sold. The biggest surprise was that he had never imagined Margaret would stop waiting for him. The next day, Jason and Emily drove to the retirement community where Margaret now lived. Throughout the trip, neither of them spoke very much. The excitement of their vacation had completely faded, replaced by confusion and growing discomfort. Jason kept replaying recent events in his mind. The hospital stay, the unanswered concerns, the assumption that everything would remain the same while he focused on his own plans. For the first time, he began viewing those memories from a different perspective. When they arrived, they were surprised by what they saw. The community was welcoming and vibrant. Residents walked along shaded paths, gathered on patios, and chatted in small groups. It did not resemble the lonely place Jason had imagined. After checking in at the front desk, they were directed to Margaret's residence. A few moments later, she opened the door herself. She looked healthier than she had in months. There was color in her face and confidence in her posture. Most surprising of all, she seemed genuinely content. Margaret welcomed them inside and offered coffee. The conversation began politely, but tension lingered beneath every word. Eventually, Jason could no longer contain his questions. He asked why she had sold the house without telling him. He asked why she had moved so quickly. He asked why she had made such major decisions on her own. Margaret listened quietly until he finished. Then she folded her hands and looked directly at her son. Her voice remained calm. There was no anger in it, no bitterness, only honesty. She reminded him of the morning she woke up in the hospital and discovered through social media that he and Emily had left the country. She described sitting alone in that room, waiting for a visit that never came. She explained how she had tried to understand and excuse the situation, only to realize that the deeper issue was not the trip itself. The deeper issue was feeling forgotten. Jason lowered his eyes. Margaret continued. She told him that during those days in the hospital, she began asking herself questions she had avoided for years. Questions about what she wanted from life. Questions about whether she had spent too much time putting her own needs aside. She explained that selling the house was not an act of punishment. It was a decision about her future. The house had become too large, too demanding, and too connected to a version of her life that no longer existed. Emily finally spoke and admitted that they should have handled things differently. She acknowledged that leaving without a proper conversation had been insensitive. Margaret nodded. She appreciated the honesty, but she did not rush to make anyone feel better. Some lessons required reflection. Some consequences required time. Jason apologized next. The words came slowly, and unlike previous apologies, they seemed genuine. He admitted that he had taken too many things for granted, including her constant presence. Margaret listened carefully before offering a small smile. She told him that relationships could recover, but only when people were willing to see the truth clearly. As the afternoon sunlight filled the room, an important shift took place. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. Instead, three people sat together confronting a reality that had been ignored for far too long. And for the first time since the hospital, Jason began to understand that the greatest loss was never the house. It was the trust his mother had quietly carried for years before finally deciding to place it somewhere else. Over the months that followed, Margaret settled into her new life with a sense of purpose she had not felt in years. What began as a painful awakening gradually transformed into something unexpected: freedom. Each morning she woke up without the responsibilities that had once consumed so much of her time and energy. She joined a walking group that met 3 times a week along the community trails. She attended book discussions, participated in local events, and formed friendships with people whose stories were just as rich and complicated as her own. For the first time in decades, her calendar reflected interests she had chosen for herself rather than obligations she had accepted for others. The proceeds from the sale of the house allowed her to live comfortably and pursue experiences she had always postponed. She enrolled in a photography class after discovering a lifelong curiosity she had never explored. She took short trips across Texas with friends from the community. She visited small towns, museums, and historic sites she had driven past for years without stopping. Each new experience reminded her that life had not become smaller with age. In many ways, it had become larger. Jason and Emily remained part of her life, but the relationship changed. They called more often. They visited regularly. Most importantly, they listened. Trust did not return overnight, nor did Margaret expect it to. Real change rarely happened that quickly. Instead, it developed through consistent actions and honest effort. Jason gradually stopped assuming that his mother would always rearrange her life around his schedule. He learned to ask questions instead of making assumptions. He learned that appreciation mattered most when expressed before it was needed rather than after it was lost. One afternoon, nearly a year after her hospital stay, Margaret attended a community gathering celebrating new residents and local volunteers. During the event, several people spoke about life transitions and unexpected second chances. As she listened, she reflected on how dramatically her own journey had changed. There had been a time when she believed the most important chapters of her life were behind her. Sitting there among friends, she realized how wrong she had been. Some of the most meaningful moments had arrived only after she stopped living according to other people's expectations. Later that evening, Jason joined her for dinner. As they sat together watching the sunset, he quietly thanked her. Margaret looked surprised and asked why. Jason admitted that although the experience had been difficult, it forced him to recognize mistakes he might never have confronted otherwise. He told her that seeing her build a happier life had changed the way he viewed family, responsibility, and respect. Margaret smiled softly. She appreciated the words, but what mattered most was the growth behind them. As the sky faded from gold to deep blue, she thought back to the lonely hospital room where everything had begun. At the time, she believed she had been abandoned. Looking back, she saw something different. That painful moment had not ended her story. It had redirected it. The greatest change was never the sale of a house. the move to a new community, or the financial decisions she made. The greatest change was learning that her value did not depend on how much she sacrificed for others. It came from recognizing her own worth. And once she finally understood that, everything else began to fall into place.